Okay, hello. All right, hi, my name is Drake. I'm a student at ASU. This is a video for Professor Hanshy's Communication in Pop Culture class. And I'm going to be doing a cultural critique and analysis of the comedian Bobby Lee. Bobby Lee is a controversial pioneering figure in the Asian American comedy scene. And he's influenced comedians such as Ken Jeong, Randall Park, Stephen Yoon, Joe Coy, so many, Russell Peters, so many Asian American comedians can identify Bobby Lee as a massive uh, path paver for them in the industry, in the entertainment industry. And I think he's a very important figure for that reason because in the history of stand-up comedy there is, well, I'd like to tie a little bit of the history of stand-up comedy in with the article we read that was called White Male and Brawny Feels Tired. Is this the age of feminist Marvel movies? One of the central messages or themes of that article is that white male buff good-looking superheroes is kind of played out. It's a tired, sort of hackneyed. Uh, it's just done so much that it's not as impactful or inspiring of a figure or of a thing to do. And in stand-up comedy's history, a lot of people can point to the first comedian they'd say is Lenny Bruce, and Lenny Bruce is a white man, from a Jewish man from New York City, and he was a good looking guy, but with a lot of comedians are a little kind of weird, not more not so brawny, I guess. But you can look at from Lenny Bruce and now take someone like Matt Rife, for example. Love him, hate him, however you feel about him. He is a big name comedian. He's white, male, conventionally attractive. So white, good, conventionally attractive, or white men have always had a presence in American stand-up comedy culture, and you can also say that black American comedians have had uh, since about like Bill Cosby, Richard Pryor, those guys sort of opened the floodgates in the late 60s and early 1970s for black entertainers, particularly men, but men and women can point to Bill Cosby and Richard Pryor as influences, especially in the stand-up comedy world. And then they influence people like Eddie Murphy, Dave Chappelle, Wanda Sykes, and count and very a lot many more. I would argue that the, Bobby Lee is that sort of figure for Asian American comedians. There were there were Asian American comedians before Bobby Lee, but none of them were like very big names. Some of them, one example of a famous Asian comedian before Bobby Lee, this, he would go by the, excuse me, by the stage name China Man. So that's kind of the where Asian comedy was for a lot of the late 21st century. And then Bobby Lee comes out in the late '90s and early 2000s in Mad TV as on a sketch comedy show, and he's doing stand-up comedy in Los Angeles and touring around the world. And it just opened people's eye. They hadn't really seen a famous Asian comedian on TV before. In fact, I have this one Reddit post here uh, that says, I just say this first paragraph is very interesting. They say, growing up in Canada in the '90s, I remember so clearly the first time I saw Bobby Lee on Mad TV. He was the first Asian person I saw on the TV who wasn't playing the stereotypical waiter in a Chinese restaurant. When we learned he was Korean, my heritage, I remember being shocked, excited, elated, proud, etc. It was paradigm shattering to realize that Asians can be funny and can be part of mainstream American culture. So that sort of highlights my point that a lot of young Asian American people would that want to dream big about being a comedian or an entertainer can Bobby Lee was sort of the first guy for them to point to and say, we can do that too, and you can trace sort of you can sort of draw a line from Bobby Lee to the success of a movie like Crazy Rich Asians, for example. A lot of the people in that movie, Ali Wong, Randall Park, uh, they will have they have acknowledged in interviews that Bobby Lee was a pioneer in that sort of sense. But there is a an other side to this that is worth examining about um, whether Bobby Lee has been too controversial and said things that were too far across the line in some instances. And he himself has expressed awareness of these sort of things. He knows that he's not a. I would not say Bobby Lee is a household name, but I would say that anyone remotely into comedy beyond just watching the box office hits has some awareness of him on average, more often than not. And uh, he does have some stories or jokes where that involve talk, that talk about race, sexuality, sexual orientation, sexual situations, where he has said some objectively horrible things. And in this same Reddit post that I was referencing earlier, where the person was expressing how happy they were to see someone like Bobby Lee on TV, someone else writes back in the comments, Bobby Lee may not have been a stereotypical waiter in a Chinese restaurant, but he was very much only doing stereotypical acts on Mad TV. Others say, um, I think this other person said, until prominent Asian Americans meaningfully condemn Bobby Lee and his racism towards Southeast Asians, any rhetoric about uplifting Southeast Asian voices or Asian unity will just be meaningless pandering. They say Bobby Lee continues to downplay and defend his racist comments and continues to spout racist ass shit about Southeast Asians while dating a Filipino American himself. So, and this is in the Asian American subreddit, so there is a lot of contention and conflicting points of view about Bobby Lee's role in Asian American representation. Uh, and I think those conversations are valid and worth having. However, uh, it's the thing about Bobby Lee in that sense is he is a victim of a lot of trauma himself. He had an incredibly abusive father that would hit him with golf clubs uh, and tell him stories about Koreans getting slaughtered by the Japanese in the war as a bedtime story, and he was molested as a child after he had gotten into methamphetamine usage in high school. So he, and this does not abscond him of not being able to make jokes without punching down from a privileged position in some sense, in some instances. It doesn't abscond him of that. But we did have this reading in class by Owen called Memory, War, and American Identity, Saving Private Ryan as Cinematic Jeremiad. Um, there's a quote in this article saying traumas are past experiences that people cannot ignore even when they would like to. Some part of the past, like it or not, is lodged in the mind, like a wound that injures and so changes the body and forces the body to respond to heal itself, but never quite the same as it was before. I think it is possible to argue that someone exposed to as much trauma as bodily is forced to respond to that trauma by making a joke out of everything. If everything's a joke, then nothing's that serious. Then what happened to me isn't that serious, and therefore it's easier to cope with it. For example, could be a line of psychological thought. It's an interesting argument. It's an interesting conversation, I should say, and I hope people keep having it. But I also hope that people will give Bobby Lee credit for being a pathfinder and opening doors for so much great Asian American written, directed entertainment and stand up comedy for everyone to enjoy. In the podcast world, he was one of the first Asian Americans to have a very large following as well. He's just been very influential. And if you haven't seen any of his work, I hope you'll consider checking it out and deciding for yourself if he goes too far or if he's just doing his best. But thank you for your time. I appreciate you.